Well, it appears perhaps some of the agents are pausing with their phones, right, to perhaps photograph or document the moment that Maduro stepped from the plane and is being taken in the clutches of American law enforcement down the steps, now in federal custody after a dramatic and, as the military called it, audacious overnight operation involving more than 150 aircraft taking off simultaneously from 20 different bases, helicopters flying at no more than 100 feet in order to extract Maduro and his wife from their hiding spot on the presidential compound in Caracas.
Aaron, what happens tonight when he gets on that helicopter and he's brought to Manhattan? What's the next step?
He'll be processed as a criminal defendant, and that means in all likelihood a photograph, a mugshot, will be taken. We may not see it. They are typically not released in the federal system. Also means fingerprints and any other brief medical screenings that need to be done. If there's medication that he takes or needs, that could be arranged for him as well. And then it's another short ride to jail where a similar procedure could begin again. But it appears now that Nicolás Maduro, under the cover of dusk and now dark, has been taken from the plane, escorted down the steps by American law enforcement, largely with the DEA. And we can tell you, Ike, the DEA administrator, Terry Cole, made the trip from Washington to be there on the tarmac to personally place Maduro under formal arrest now that he's on American soil.
Early Saturday morning, the United States conducted what President Trump called a large-scale strike on Venezuela. Hours later, Nicolás Maduro, Venezuela's president for the past 13 years, was escorted off a U.S. federal aircraft in New York, flanked by FBI and DEA agents. He's now in federal custody at a detention center in Manhattan, facing narco-terrorism charges. This is the first time the United States has taken a sitting foreign head of state into custody in 36 years. The last time was Manuel Noriega in Panama, and that operation remains controversial to this day. Right now, a lot is confirmed, a lot remains unclear, and the implications, legal, constitutional, geopolitical, are profound. Let's break down what we actually know, what we don't know yet, and why this matters. The timeline is tight and the facts are stark. Around 2 in the morning local time in Venezuela, that's 6 a.m. GMT, explosions were heard in Caracas. Witnesses reported at least 7 blasts. The operation lasted less than 30 minutes according to initial reports, though Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane later said the full operation took just over 2 hours. Targets included Fuerte Tiuna, Venezuela's largest military complex. Fires were visible from a distance. La Guaira port near Caracas took what Reuters called severe damage. Multiple locations in Caracas and surrounding states were hit. At 4:21 a.m. Eastern Time, Trump posted on Truth Social, quote, "We have successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela," end quote. He announced that Nicolás Maduro and his wife had been, quote, "captured and flown out of the country," end quote. He named the operation Absolute Resolve. Delta Force, the elite army unit, was reportedly involved in the capture. Trump later said there were a few injuries among U.S. forces, but no deaths. Maduro was extracted by helicopter from Venezuela, flown to the USS Iwo Jima, that's an amphibious assault ship, then transferred to a U.S. federal aircraft. He landed at Stewart Air National Guard Base in New York around 5:25 p.m. Eastern on Saturday. We have photos and video of this. Maduro wearing a light blue hoodie, walking slowly down the aircraft stairs one step at a time, surrounded by agents with FBI and DEA jackets clearly visible. His wife, Celia Flores, was undergoing additional medical checks before transport. Maduro is now at Metropolitan Detention Center in New York. Arraignment is scheduled for Monday in Manhattan Federal Court. So those are the confirmed facts. The operation happened. Maduro is in U.S. custody. There's visual evidence. Multiple sources confirm the timeline. The legal case against Maduro isn't new. In March 2020, the Southern District of New York unsealed an indictment charging Maduro and 14 current or former Venezuelan officials with running what prosecutors called a vast criminal enterprise for the last 20 years. The allegations? Narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, weapons possession conspiracy. Prosecutors claim Maduro used state resources to fuel an international drug trade, partnering with Colombian rebel groups to, quote, flood the United States with cocaine, end quote. The U.S. had a $50 million bounty on Maduro, one of the highest bounties the U.S. government has ever offered. That was increased from $25 million in August 2025. In November 2025, the Trump administration designated Maduro as head of a foreign terrorist organization, putting him on the same list as Al-Qaeda and the Houthis. On Saturday, the Justice Department unsealed updated charges. Attorney General Pam Bondi said Maduro and his wife will, quote, soon face the full wrath of American justice on American soil in American courts, end quote. So the indictment exists. It's been public since 2020. The charges are serious. What's unprecedented is how the U.S. chose to enforce it. Well, for people who don't follow Venezuelan politics closely, here's the essential context. Nicolás Maduro is 63 years old, former bus driver, union leader, rose through Venezuela's Socialist Party ranks as a protege of Hugo Chavez. When Chavez died of cancer in 2013, Maduro succeeded him as president. His 13 years in power saw Venezuela's economy collapse, hyperinflation, widespread shortages. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country, the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. Maduro arrested opposition leaders, packed the courts, disbanded the opposition-led National Assembly. In 2024, Venezuela held presidential elections. Maduro claimed victory with 51% of the vote, but refused to show evidence. The United States and many other nations recognize the opposition leader, Edmundo González Urrutia, as the legitimate winner. González is currently in exile. Venezuela matters geopolitically for one major reason: oil. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, 303 billion barrels. That's larger than Saudi Arabia. The oil industry has been gutted by mismanagement, sanctions, and underinvestment, but the reserves are still there. The United States has interests here beyond oil. Cocaine trafficking routes run through Venezuela. Millions of Venezuelans fleeing the country create migration pressure at the U.S. southern border. And there's the geopolitical competition. China has loaned Venezuela billions and has oil contracts. Russia has military cooperation and arms sales. Both see Venezuela as a counterweight to U.S. influence in the hemisphere. So when Trump says the U.S. will seize Venezuela's oil reserves, that's not abstract. That's the world's largest proven reserves of oil. At a press conference at Mar-a-Lago, Trump described this as an extraordinary military operation, unlike anything since World War II. Then he said something that raises enormous questions. Trump says the United States will, quote, run the country, end quote, for an unspecified period. He said there is, quote, nobody to take over, end quote, in Venezuela. He said a team of cabinet officials plus a, quote, local team in Venezuela, end quote, will govern. He said the U.S. will, quote, seize the oil reserves, end quote. American companies will enter, spend billions, start making money for the country. U.S. troops will provide security. Let's be clear about what's unclear here. Who specifically is this local team in Venezuela? How long is this occupation planned to last? What legal authority exists for the United States to govern a foreign nation? Who controls the Venezuelan military now? Who controls Venezuelan government institutions? Edmundo González Urrutia, The opposition leader the U.S. recognized as the legitimate election winner has not been installed as president. He has not returned to Venezuela. Trump did not announce a transition to Gonzales. Instead, Trump announced what appears to be a U.S.-run transitional authority. This raises questions that don't have answers yet. Is this a military occupation? It appears so. Trump says troops will provide security. What happens to Venezuela's constitution? What about their National Assembly? Who has access to the Venezuelan treasury? Venezuela's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, condemned what she called grave military aggression and demanded proof of life from Maduro and his wife. The Venezuelan government has not confirmed that Maduro is in U.S. custody, though we have photos and video showing he clearly is. What we don't know is whether Venezuela's military has surrendered, accepted U.S. control, or is preparing to resist. Here's where things get complicated legally. The United States conducted military strikes on a foreign country, captured its head of state, and announced it will govern that country. What legal authority justifies this? The Trump administration has not provided a clear public explanation of what legal authority it's relying on. What we have are competing justifications from different officials. Vice President J.D. Vance said on social media that Trump didn't need congressional authorization because Maduro has multiple indictments in the United States for narco-terrorism. His argument: you don't get to avoid justice for drug trafficking just because you live in a palace in Caracas. The problem with that justification: if the executive branch can use its own indictments to authorize military strikes, Congress is never needed. The president could indict anyone anywhere and then invade to arrest them. Senator Mike Lee, a Trump ally, spoke with Secretary of State Marco Rubio. According to Lee, Rubio said the military action was deployed to protect and defend those executing the arrest warrant. This falls under the president's inherent authority under Article 2 to protect U.S. personnel. The problem with that justification: no U.S. personnel were under attack in Venezuela before the operation. If protecting people executing an arrest warrant justifies military strikes, that would authorize military action anywhere in the world to protect anyone making an arrest. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth called it a law enforcement exercise that doesn't require congressional notification. The problem with that justification: law enforcement doesn't typically involve airstrikes on a country's capital and major military installations. Secretary of State Rubio said this was a trigger-based mission where conditions had to be met night after night, and congressional notification beforehand would have jeopardized the mission. The problem with that justification: the War Powers Act allows 48 hours after military action for notification. The administration didn't notify Congress in those 48 hours either. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said he learned about the operation from news reports, not from any briefing. Here's what the law actually says. The Constitution gives Congress the sole power to declare war. That's Article 1, Section 8. The War Powers Act, passed in 1973 after Vietnam, requires congressional authorization for military action except in 3 cases: a declaration of war, specific statutory authorization, or a national emergency created by an attack on the United States or its territories. None of those apply here. Venezuela didn't attack the United States. Congress didn't authorize this. There's no declaration of war. Even if you claim national emergency, the War Powers Act requires notification to Congress within 48 hours. That didn't happen. And it requires congressional authorization within 60 days, or withdrawal of forces. We're nowhere near that timeline yet, but the clock is ticking. Multiple Democratic members of Congress are calling this illegal. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries said the House and Senate must be briefed immediately and that Trump has not sought congressional authorization and failed to properly notify Congress. Senator Tim Kaine said, quote, "I think these strikes are clearly illegal," end quote. Representative Seth Moulton, an Iraq veteran, said Congress did not authorize this war, and Venezuela posed no imminent threat to the United States. Republicans are largely supporting the operation. Senator Tom Cotton hailed it as an incredible operation. Speaker Mike Johnson said the administration will schedule briefings when Congress returns next week. But even some Trump allies are noting the legal questions. Senator Mike Lee acknowledged there was no congressional approval or authorization prior to action. The legal questions don't stop at U.S. constitutional law. There's also international law. The United Nations Charter, Article 2, Paragraph 4, prohibits the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. There are two exceptions: self-defense under Article 51 or authorization by the UN Security Council. The United States has neither. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said he is deeply alarmed and that the rules of international law have not been respected. This constitutes a dangerous precedent. Russia and China both issued strong condemnations. Russia called it armed aggression and an unacceptable assault on Venezuela's sovereignty. China said it was deeply shocked by the blatant use of force against a sovereign state. The regional response is striking. Brazil's President Lula said this crosses an unacceptable line and evokes the worst moments of interference in Latin America. Colombia deployed security forces to the border, preparing for refugees. France said the operation violates the principle of not resorting to force that underpins international law. Even allies who dislike Maduro expressed concern. The EU said Maduro lacks legitimacy, but the UN Charter must be respected. The UK said it sheds no tears about the end of Maduro's regime, but reiterated support for international law. Israel commended the operation. Venezuelan opposition leader Edmundo Gonzalez said Venezuelans are ready for reconstruction. An emergency UN Security Council meeting is scheduled for January 5th at the request of Colombia, Russia, and China. Legal scholars are weighing in. Zenaida Miller from Northeastern University called this a blatant violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. She said international law is quite clear that one country cannot lawfully overthrow the leader of another, nor can it try them in its domestic courts. The last time the United States took a foreign head of state into custody was 36 years ago, January 3rd, 1990. That was Manuel Noriega in Panama. Noriega was also indicted on drug trafficking charges in U.S. courts. The U.S. invaded Panama in December 1989 in Operation Just Cause. Noriega surrendered on January 3rd, 1990, exactly 36 years to the day before Maduro's capture. That operation relied on a secret Office of Legal Counsel memo authorizing the action. The memo argued the president's Article 2 powers allow use of force to apprehend defendants. That memo remains controversial to this day, but there are significant differences between Panama in 1989 and Venezuela in 2026. Panama was a smaller country, easier to control. The U.S. had the Panama Canal Zone with existing military presence. Venezuela is larger, has significant oil wealth, complex geopolitics, and major powers like China and Russia with significant interests there. And importantly, Panama in '89 had more Latin American support. The Venezuela operation in 2026 faces widespread condemnation from the region. Compare this to other recent regime changes. Iraq in 2003 had congressional authorization, a coalition of nations, and months of public buildup. Libya in 2011 had UN Security Council authorization, a NATO coalition, and no U.S. ground troops. Afghanistan in 2001 had congressional authorization after 9/11 as a direct response to the attacks. Venezuela in 2026 has no congressional authorization, No UN authorization, no coalition, and is a unilateral US action. Maduro also had no International Criminal Court warrant. Putin has an ICC warrant. Netanyahu has an ICC warrant. Maduro only had a US domestic indictment. If the United States can invade a country based on its own indictments, that sets a precedent where any country can create jurisdiction anywhere by simply issuing an indictment. This isn't extradition. Extradition is a legal process involving treaties, court proceedings, and consent. This is what's called rendition, seizing a person in a foreign country without that country's consent. But rendition via full military invasion and announced occupation is something we haven't seen in decades. Monday, Maduro appears in Manhattan federal court for arraignment. He'll almost certainly plead not guilty. Bail will almost certainly be denied. The trial could take years. But the bigger questions are about Venezuela itself. Who is running the country right now? Trump says the US will, but hasn't specified who, how, or for how long. Will the Venezuelan military resist or surrender? Will there be an insurgency? Venezuela is much larger and more complex than Panama was in '89. Senator Kaine promised to force a war powers resolution vote this week. The House Democratic Conference scheduled the call for Sunday. The UN Security Council meets January 5th. These are the immediate political responses to watch. And then there are the unknowns about oil, refugees, regional stability, and whether this becomes a sustainable occupation or another protracted conflict. In the next 72 hours, Monday's arraignment and whether Maduro challenges U.S. jurisdiction, whether the Venezuelan military resists or surrenders, whether U.S. troops actually deploy and in what numbers, whether Edmundo Gonzalez returns to Caracas, what the administration tells Congress in briefings when they return. In the next 2 weeks, Senator Kaine's promised war powers resolution vote, what comes out of Sunday's House Democratic Conference call, the UN Security Council meeting on January 5th, whether refugees start flowing toward Colombia, which U.S. oil companies enter Venezuela. Longer term, can the United States sustain running Venezuela indefinitely? Will there be an insurgency from Maduro loyalists? Will the International Criminal Court or other international bodies investigate? How does this affect 2026 midterms? Does impeachment discussion gain traction? And Maduro's trial itself could take years. Set aside for a moment whether you think Maduro is a criminal who deserved this, or whether you think this is an illegal invasion. Those are important questions, but they're not the only questions. This matters because of precedent. If a U.S. domestic indictment plus military force equals jurisdiction anywhere in the world, what stops other countries from doing the same? China has indicted Taiwanese leaders. Russia has indicted Ukrainian officials. If this becomes the standard, international law becomes meaningless. This matters because of process. The Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war, specifically to prevent one person from unilaterally committing the nation to military conflict. If the president can launch an invasion, capture a foreign leader, and announce a military occupation without congressional authorization or even notification, that's a fundamental shift in how war powers work. This matters because we don't know what comes next. Iraq and Afghanistan were supposed to be quick operations. They weren't. Venezuela is larger and more complex than Panama was. Trump says the U.S. will run the country, but hasn't said for how long, or with what resources, or with whose consent. And this matters because the international reaction is merely unanimous condemnation from U.S. allies and adversaries alike. When France, Brazil, and Colombia, countries that have no love for Maduro, are all saying this violates international law, that's significant. We're in the early hours of this story. A lot will become clear in the coming days and weeks. What we know right now is that the United States captured a sitting foreign head of state, announced it will govern his country and did so without congressional authorization or international legal basis that's been made public. What happens next will tell us a lot about how war powers, international law, and U.S. foreign policy function in this era. We'll be watching.
Thanks for spending a few minutes digging into this with me. If you want more grounded, progressive commentary without the outrage bait, subscribe and stick around. Every time you watch, share, and engage, it helps build a community that believes democracy is worth understanding and defending. I'll see you in the next video.